Why We Bleep is sponsored by Signal Sounds. Christmas is here, and I've been getting in the mood in the only way I know how, by drowning my lonely sorrows by buying things. Today, I'm buying incredibly weird and mind-expanding devices from signalsounds.com. I've got myself the most appropriately named device December can offer. It's the Neutral Lab Scrooge! Humbug to normal drum machines, you're the ghost of Christmas past! I've heard the future, Tiny Tim, and it's a glitchy fever dream! Sounds like Mr. Wazzo falling down the stairs! I suppose it is rather dry, so that's why I also purchased enough effects units to wet 2 million tons of Jacob's crackers! First up on the chain is the T-Rex Benson Echo Rack, perfect for slushy, grimy dub techno repeats. Next up is the EchoFix EFX2 Tape Echo, perfect for slushy, grimy dub techno repeats. And finally on my chain, the Eventide H90. It's perfect for cavernous shimmer reverbs and then slushy, grimy dub techno repeats. Damn, it sounds good in here. If only I had friends to share my turkey dinner with. Anyway, I'm going to level with you. With all the money I've spent, the only turkey I can afford this year is a packet of turkey-flavoured crisps. God bless us, everyone. So, although money can't buy you love nor friends, it can buy you bitchin' effects units and drum machines. So visit signalsounds.com. That's signalsounds.com. Why We Bleep is also sponsored by thonk.co.uk. This month, Stephen wanted me to let you know that there's this place called Thonk. And what Thonk is a place that you can get kits to build studio equipment and Eurorack modular synthesizers. And are these kits easy to build? Why, yes, they are. All the kits are incredibly well organised, so you get all the little bits that you need in the packet. It's like Lego. Do you remember building Lego when you were a little kid? Oh, it can be like that again, but at the end of it, you'll have something that makes horrendous noises, that keeps all your neighbours awake, and makes all your friends terribly jealous. So if you're interested in building kits, I've got a deal for you. Thonk are offering 10% discount until the 1st of January 2025. You can apply 10% discount on anything on the store that is not already on sale or is a book. They're already tremendous value. You can take 10% off everything else until the 1st of Jan 2025 with this code. Enter the phrase love synth. One word, love synth. You have till the 1st of January 2025 to get some sweet discounts on things you can make yourself. Visit thonk.co.uk. That's thonk.co.uk. Why? Yes, indeed. Today I present a conversation with none other than Robert Henke. You may know Robert Henke as Monolake. Monolake is a musical project that started with Robert and Gerhard Berles. I hope I'm pronouncing your surname right, Mr. Gerhard. Who made beautiful and interesting electronic music and continue to do so. Robert, actually, I should be clear, is the solo person in Monolake now, because Gerhard got really busy with this other project that these two are known for. And that project is a piece of software that I'm using this very second to record this. It's called Ableton Live. It's probably the most used DAW, and certainly I would argue in many respects the most creative and I can't say interesting, because all the DAWs are interesting and it's all just a question of what you put into it. But Ableton Live has become for many people the premier way of, conduiting their creativity. It's how so many people make music now. And That, however, is not the end of the story because tellingly, Robert uses a great deal of hardware. I say great deal, actually. I mean, Robert would say, as he says in here, that he's kind of pared things down in many respects, but he has got amazing taste. He's got some really interesting bits of kit, and he's got history with some really interesting bits of kit that concern this podcast, namely things like the Synclavier. And in this conversation, I wanted to basically needle someone who has so significantly blended the worlds of hardware and software. If you tried to record hardware and to blend the two together, I think it's hard to do well. I think it's too easy to fixate on any one particular thing. I find that when I stare at the computer, it has its own sort of influence upon me. And when I limit myself to a simple selection of hardware, obviously that then also imposes its own limitations on me. The ability to just endlessly add tracks and layer things up in this infinite tape machine that is Ableton Live is both the greatest thing in the world and also a colossal and vast trap. And in this conversation, I had the opportunity to ask Robert, a person who is partially responsible for the invention of Ableton Live. For him and Gerhard created Ableton Live as a tool that they needed to help play live, and from it has now evolved into this thing that millions of people use as their vehicle for producing music. So this is a really interesting conversation with someone who is basically responsible for one of the most significant pieces of music technology possibly of all time, but is also a person trying to use it in his own way to blend hardware and software together. It's a really interesting chat, and I hope that you will get a lot from it. I am, as ever, deeply indebted to the beautiful people who consider sponsoring Why We Bleep on Patreon. And if you're enjoying Why We Bleep, please do consider sponsoring on Patreon. It is patreon.com/Mylar Melodies, where you can sponsor for a paltry amount of money to help fund future podcasts and also videos. So if you are enjoying these, please consider hopping on there. I would love you greatly if you did. Without further ado, let's talk to Robert Henke of Monolake and Ableton fame. Thanks. Talk to you about studios. Obviously, you've got, I love the blurb that you've got with the new album, which is, about studios, the whole thing of the being your sort of happy place, your home, your cradle. But they, as you well know, are not that Rome is not built in a day. You will likely go through many iterations throughout your life as you find a good way of working. And so I guess my first thing, I would love to just pick your brains about the studios you've had, particularly, tell me about your space as you arrange it. And then can you tell me about how it has evolved, from your first spaces to now? How do you like to do it? And what do you give yourself? What do you put around yourself?
I had a phase where I thought I can do everything in software, of course. This was not a coincidence. A little bit after the first version of Live came out, where I thought, okay, I can get rid of all these machines and I can use a laptop and headphones, and this is my portable paradise. And whilst it worked in theory, I have to admit that my engineer soul kind of loves machines, and I get inspiration from being surrounded by machines, and I get some joy out of them. It's like if you're sitting in front of a beautiful old grand piano, it makes you want to make music. And I have a similar feeling when I'm in my studio and there's machines that I really like. They suggest something to me, and they suggest a sound, they suggest an expression, and this dialogue between the machines and in a way also with the people who built those machines in the first place, for me is it's joyful and it's playful, and
Yeah.
this is important for me. So after this short period of having just a laptop uh, in my living room, where I then added one keyboard and then I added another keyboard, and then there needed to be an external effects unit and a mixer, and I suddenly realized myself that I'm slowly rebuilding a studio in my living room. And then I thought, wait a moment, this is somehow the wrong approach. So I went back to find a dedicated room, and that's where I am now.
Can you tell me about the layout and kind of how you've, for those who can't see you, you've got like shelving and you've got like effects and things on a second shelf and stuff below it. You have a sort of quite a workshop vibe.
See, the centerpiece of my studio is the big screen. So my main listening position is not the mixing desk, but the big screen. I'm too much a software person for having the big mixing desk in front of the speakers. So left and right of the screen is my main monitors, and this is where most of my music happens. And then I have on the left and on the right a few dedicated keyboards, and it's a very small space I'm in here. And I try to really push on the ergonomics of it so that I can reach everything quickly, and that uh, everything that I want to adjust is in a position where I can adjust it. I'm always amazed if I look at these photos from big studios and then you see a Eventide or Lexicon effect mounted in a rack on the bottom. You think,
Yeah.
exactly,
The down low one.
who is ever
Yeah.
going be on their knees editing those and actually still hearing something? So that makes no sense to me. This is just for showing off. And so there's a few keyboards on the left side and there's a few keyboards on the right. But overall, it's not a big space. It's not a big show off space in terms see how many keyboards I could buy. Everything in here has a purpose and a personal history. And yeah, that's it.
Do you have the particular keyboards that you had and sold?
I made the experience that I tend to think a lot before I buy something, and usually I either immediately sell it because I made a mistake, or they stay with me forever. The only
Right. Wow.
exception of a kind of complicated love-hate relationship was the Waldorf microwave. I bought it when it came out. I hated it. I sold it pretty much immediately. I bought it again 2 years later because so many of my friends used it to great effect. Then I found it too dominant in the mix everywhere, so I sold it again. And a year ago, I saw one in mint condition for a very, very low price in a local shop, and I just bought it. And now I really like it. But most of the machines here um, have been my kind of companions since a long time, and they have all their own history and personal value to me. I mean, there's the SY77, which is the first
Oh my
big
God, yeah.
FM synthesizer I bought, and I also had a TG77, which is basically the same without keyboard and individual outputs, and all the drums on the early Monolake records are FM drums created with this machine. And
Oh, are they? I
yeah,
have one of those down here. It's actually at the bottom, Robert, I have to admit, but
and you need an editor. I mean, you can't read the text anymore on the buttons because they're completely worn off.
Amazing. Tell me about that machine particularly, because I know it's like wave tables and FM and drums, right?
That's the
and
thing.
Effects.
It went too far into this kind of workstation direction, which obscures the beauty of it. So there is this quite cheesy ROM samples, like grand piano, saxophone stuff, and there's relatively cheesy drums, and you can forget about all of that unless you want to go for a dedicated cheesiness, which can be
It's a
fun
thing.
again. But there's also a 6 operator FM engine in there, and you can stack 2 of them together. And so, in a way, you get something that is more powerful than a DX1 into that
Yeah.
machine, plus multi-timbral, plus 16 voices. And that is quite cool. So, uh, I only see this as a very advanced FM synthesizer, and that's it.
Do you have a sort of approach to programming FM that makes it manageable? Because there's sort of part of me that's like daunted by, you know, that many operators. I have like a TX81Z as well, so I'm like, oh, 4, phew, you know, and some built-in waveforms. But do you? What would you say is like the approach to like making FM fun?
Using 2 operators and getting the basic sound out of it, and then refining later. So, because with 2 operators, you can get the basic quality of it. And this is why so
Yeah.
many simpler FM engines just have these 2 operators, because that is for me the core of it, and the rest is refining it. Um, but it's like with any other form of synthesis or machine. You either feel at home with the way it works or you don't. And I would always say to people, hey, if you don't like a specific synthesizer, um, it's completely fine. You know, if everyone tells you that this machine is great and you say, okay, I don't like it, then you don't like it, period.
Mm.
Because there's nothing absolute here. So many people, for instance, the Oberheim Expander is an interesting one. I admire it as a technological masterpiece. The complexity they managed to get into this unit back in these days is stunning. Uh, it is really interesting in terms of everything can modulate everything. It's super powerful. But in general, I'm personally not a friend of the overall Oberheim sound aesthetics. So I hear a lot of great music that people make with it. But for me, this kind of brassy, bright sounds,
Mm.
it just doesn't. It's not the color palette I'm looking for normally, and this is just a very personal feeling that I'm. It's not my colors, but it doesn't mean that it's a bad or good machine.
If you had to like define the quality in synths that you're actually looking for, I mean, you said that you either know or you don't know. Is there something in like the interface or the sound or a marriage of the two? Do you know what it is that you gel with?
I think I like sounds that are somehow lively. So that there's some oscillation going on in the background, some complexity. I like dark tones. I like inharmonic spectra, those kinds of things. And all the
Mm.
machines I have here are either very gritty, early digital synthesizers that have their very own life because of the technical limitations, like early sampling or
Yeah.
um, early digital synthesizers. Or they are capable of creating really nice, darker timbres, like with nice filters that allow to really cut off everything, so that there's just this nice low string, distant, noisy strings, stuff like that. Uh, so that is for me a quality I'm looking for. You know, if I add reverb to things, I'm never looking for the short rehearsal room drum kit sound, but I'm always looking for the completely non-realistic hyper cathedral chorusing. You know,
I'm with you on that.
I,
Yeah, yeah. With like, and with Cruft, right? With the sort of, do you like that kind of early 80s sort of the
oh,
digital
of course. I
fizz
mean,
and the
the
texture?
H3000, for instance, it's noisy in a way, and it's the modulation is very audible in some cases. But I like this because it feels alive. Um, because if I want to have a perfect, crystal clear reverb, then I use convolution these days, and I just slap the impulse response of Saint whatever cathedral on it, and there we go. You know.
Can you talk about the sort of the melding of software and hardware? As obviously there is, you know, as you say, I'm a computer guy, and as we know, there is a certain computer program that you are well associated with, and it's like the marriage of software and hardware. I think it's quite. I find it tricky personally. I find that I tend to gravitate to one or the other, and I personally actually find the blending of the two to be quite difficult because. It's probably illustrates a lack of discipline
on
my
everybody's
part.
part.
And I think, well, exactly, because I think you fixate on what you're looking at. You know, as you say with the computer, if you're looking at a screen, if I'm looking at Ableton Live, then I fixate on that. And I tend to like live with an Ableton Live. And something I've tried to do consciously, I've not yet set up in this new studio that I built, is to like have a couple of things next to my computer. But then I will separately have places that I make music with just hardware. And so I don't marry the two. And I suppose I want to pick your brains about how do you marry the two? Because it seems to be that you've found a good way of doing it.
It's, of course, always an interesting question. What I'm doing is that most of the time I either work with the computer and not touching any of the other machines, or I'm creating sounds, structures, themes with the old machines, and then I record them. But as soon as it's done, I'm back to software. So what really never happens is that I have what I would call a living hybrid set, where there's a set running in live and I'm triggering 5 synthesizers and re-recording them and working on this for a month. I like the idea that when I'm using hardware, I need to be decisive. So I record a sound, I record a riff, and I say, that's it. And then afterwards, I turn the hardware off and I'm fine. And this turned out to be quite fruitful. What I also very often do is that I have deliberate sessions where I'm exploring hardware without any musical idea in my mind in the first place. So I'm just saying, okay, I feel like playing with I don't know, the Prophet VS again and see what it can do to me. And then I make some presets if I like them, or I immediately record some stuff. Like, this preset sounds really great if I just play this massive minor 7/9 whatever chord on it. Let's just record this for 30 seconds. And maybe I end up using it somewhere, or I don't. And I record a lot of drums all the time. I really enjoy creating drum sounds. And this means when I'm working on a piece and I have the feeling that, it would be nice to have a different snare here, I just can go through a vast collection of snares that I made, or sounds that have a similar function. And this way I can combine the capabilities of my studio and the richness of my sound sources with a very fast pace of working.
How do you organize your samples as well? You know, when you have those kinds of sessions, isn't it tempting to just leave them within a live set, or how do you get them out and name them, and how do you organize them so you can actually find them
for the
again?
drum samples, I wrote a little Max for Live helper that allows me to record individual hits quickly and name them in a successive naming. So I say, and I always wanted to make this public, but there's a few quirks that I still need to solve before doing it, because I don't want to release something that is semi-finished.
Yeah.
But basically, you know, let's say, again, stay with the Prophet VS. I made this kind of resonant filtered Kraftwerk-ish zonk sound. So I just name it zonk, and then I play a note. If I like it, I hit capture, and it records it and creates the file, makes the fade out and everything. So the process of going from playing a drum sound, or for instance from my modular system, creating a drum sound and getting it as a file into my live library is very straightforward.
That's good. Like an auto sampler type thing, but
something like this.
Yeah, I see.
It goes in this direction, yes. But
there is
much simpler.
Yeah, like Sample Robot, I know is like a commercial piece of software that I've sort of looked at and I probably need to invest. It feels like Surprise Live doesn't do that. Like,
well, Live does a lot. There's a lot of things Live doesn't do.
It has sliced in your MIDI track and whatever, but it doesn't, you know, That's such a nice. And when you have this, then is there a particular way that you organize your sample library? Do you do it by like? I know some people who do it by like years, and I know that some people do it differently. I'm curious how you organize your structure all of this collection, because you have a lot of data.
Next question.
No,
No,
it sounds like you're like me. It's just
it's as pretty much every library of every person I know. There's a certain shall we call it organicness to it?
Oh, I like that. Yeah, idiosyncrasy. You know where everything is, but you wouldn't expect someone else to.
Exactly. So I try to have a kind of consistent folder naming and putting stuff in subfolders if necessary. But at the end of the day, there's a folder called ASR10, and there's a folder called drums, and there's a folder called drums inside ASR10, and then there's a folder
Okay,
inside
yeah.
drums that is called ASR10. Ah!
Yeah, okay. Fine. I wanted to ask you also about limitations. I watched your loop talk from 2015, and like there's like my favorite line that like leapt out is like you said, speaking of electronic musicians and speaking of limitations, we can add the 7th, 9th, and 11th string to a guitar immediately instead of actually making sense of the song. And I wondered what are the limitations that you like to give yourself, and how do you actually stick to them when you're making music?
That's an interesting question again and again, because I don't have one single it fits all answer to this. Depending on what I want to do, I try to get some sort of mental clarity first about what it is I'm approaching. And then starting from that, I decide which are the things I might or might not do to reach that goal. Things are much easier actually when I prepare performances, because there the limitations are much more tangible. I need to be able to carry stuff around. I need to be able to operate this stuff in real time. So I'm just right now actually preparing a drone ambient soundscape multi-channel performance that I perform in Italy in 3 days. And it's clear I have an EasyJet flight and I want to travel with hand luggage. So my choice of controllers is very limited. And that means that I try to fit everything in a limited number of tracks with a limited number of effects. But I think very, very closely about how do I want to articulate them. So there's this, cheap Novation launch control here in front of me. And I spend a lot of time thinking about exactly what do these 3 knobs above the fader actually doing for each track. And is it something that I can play, articulate in a meaningful way? What does it mean in different parts of the song? Do they need to switch function or not? So I try to embrace the limitation from a conceptual perspective first. And when working on tracks in the studio, in live, where I have no real limitations, I try to get an understanding at an early stage, what is this track actually about? What is it I want to achieve with it? And I feel it's a question of practice. It's much easier for me these days to say, no, I'm not adding another layer than it was in the earlier days. I had this really interesting moment just a few days ago where I was working on something and I had the feeling that I could add another very high pitched note, even theme somewhere, because I was feeling it was missing. And then I tried it out and I immediately noticed that this new sound is alien to the piece and it moves the attention somewhere else. And the piece is completely fine as it is. And I actually removed a few more elements because very often it is the issue that when you're working all yourself on electronic music, you're listening to it again and again and again all the time, and you get bored by your own music. And this is when you start to add layers and layers and layers. And then you go back to it a year, a month, or whatever later, and you notice, oh my God, it's a big mess. It's all too much. And then you mute 50% of the tracks, and suddenly the magic is back.
Yeah. This is, I suppose it's one of the things with hardware that's so much easier because you simply can't.
You can't, exactly.
If you're doing like live, from a MIDI sequencer. I'm thinking like today when we're speaking is the day that Ableton have announced the Move controller as well, or the Move sequencer, and I know it's 4 tracks.
Exactly, and this was a deliberate decision, and of course a controversial decision, and it took long to get there, because it was a decision about the size of the box. It was a decision of the necessary CPU. So there's a lot of constraints that go into making such a decision. But of course, it was also a question of, is this enough? Or is this way too little? Or can this still be meaningful? And there was endless debates inside the company if this is makes sense or not. And ultimately, I think the fact that it's so limited in a specific way, like the 4 tracks, whilst being quite open and potentially even more opening at some later point, makes it limited but interesting. And well, for the rest, we will see.
You literally said in that loop talk as well, I may be getting your words wrong, but you said words to the effect of, if your song isn't working with 64 tracks, maybe you should try 8. And by extension 8, then 4. Exactly. Yeah, I look at it and I have no, like, maybe I'm getting old enough that I do have some of that. Or what's the word? I appreciate the limitations in gear. What is the point of hardware if not to be limited in some interesting way? That's the...
Absolutely. I mean, an interesting candidate for me is always drum machines, because there is no real need for a drum machine anymore, unless you need to carry it with you. Because in the studio, if I want to have a drum pattern, I mean, so many ways to do this in live or in any software on this planet. And having these 12 or what they are sounds from the Lindrum in my folder is, it's not that hard. And I'm not going to engage in the discussion of microscopic artifacts that make all the difference of the world. No one cares at the end if the groove is good. But still, I have one drum computer, actually the Lindrum here, simply because of the fact that sometimes I enjoy to have the computer off and just on the fly programming a drum pattern. And programming the drum pattern really means emptying the pattern, pressing record, hearing the click, playing it, doing 2-3 overdubs, deleting a wrong one, doing it again, and there's the groove. And this is so satisfying because it is so much the opposite of how I work when programming, when sitting in front of the computer. I can do this late at night when I'm really tired. And it puts me in a different mindset. And this is what I really like. And if instead of the Lindrum, it would be something like a more complex, more contemporary drum machine, where the first interaction would be selecting my samples, I would immediately get lost in trying to find the best snare for that kick. And then I found the best snare, and then I find the hi-hat is wrong, and then I change the kick, and then I go to bed frustrated. So the limitation actually allows me to be creative.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to invent the wheel every time we make a song. It is what's the word? A dichotomy, because as electronic musicians, I almost feel like we have an obligation to reinvent the wheel and do something that has never been heard before, because you can. But then that has to be balanced with the reality that you have to live within limitations. And I suppose it returns what you said before about, the fact is that you think ahead about what the song is that you want it to be. To me, that is the key difference, I think, and is a key point, is that if you don't think about the song ahead of time, then when you're faced with something like a computer, then potentially you have you have no direction.
I mean, to be fair, I think there's also value in not knowing at all how things evolve and just playing around. But at some point in time, either an idea emerges, or you are just saying, okay, this was a nice session tonight and it's over.
Yeah.
That's not so different from the old days when I was still working with Gerhard, and we were pretty much more or less exclusively using hardware and drum computers and hardware sequencers, or a small max patch that worked as a sequencer. The operation work was, we met and we were just playing and recording it on a DAT tape. And maybe we played for 2 hours and recorded 2 hours. And at the end of the 2 hours, we already knew that this DAT tape can be overwritten the next session, or we knew that there's something on it that is worth editing down. So there's these two possibilities there. And it's completely fine that not everything you do needs to end up in a track, because ultimately we do what we do because we enjoy it. And the joy sometimes is just this aimless happiness with exploring what you have. But I want to come back to this idea of every sound has to be new. I find the great power of electronic music is not the fact that you can do these extremely complicated things. It is the fact that by combining a few simple things, you can immediately reach novelty. Now, I take the output from the Lindrum, let's say the snare, and I put it through a low pass filter or a high pass filter from a modular rig, and I pipe this into a 20 euro flea market quad reverb. And here is my crazy, distorted, completely different snare sound. It's right there, and it did cost me 5 minutes and was a lot of fun to do. And it's my unique only sound, and it has always been like this. Oh, put a speaker in your bathroom, play the bass drum through the speaker in your bathroom, and put a microphone in the bathroom, and you have the early Depeche Mode snare. Bass drum. It's so rewarding to just say, use your imagination and use your tools and figure out what you can do with them. I think this is always my advice if people ask me, oh, I want to start producing music. What do I need? And I say, the smallest possible setup.
Yeah, and a bit of intent. I suppose that's the thing. It's just knowing knowing where to place your energies, knowing that you can just explore effects with simple sounds versus you would just go on Splice and just look through the sounds. There is a difference there. I also, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, which could be a way of doing that, is, do you separate the sound design and the composition process? Because for you, it seems your music is so innately tied with sound design. It's like a relishing of the sounds and the composition of sounds. But do you separate? How do you do it?
No, the sound design is absolutely integral. Take a piece like Cute Little Aliens on the studio album. The title came from the fact that I was playing with resynthesis on the Synclavier, and suddenly there was kind of crap coming up that immediately reminded me to a Foley sound of some weird alien creature. And once I had this association in my mind, it became clear that the track has to have more of those sounds. So I spent an afternoon or two trying different ways to create sounds that I somehow associated with this idea of no, this classical sci-fi trope of the cute little alien that we all, of course, immediately know when watching it. It's not cute, but in the movie they all think it's still cute because it's so tiny and has eyes. And so I spent quite some time to think about sounds that would fit in there. And then I added those little aliens to this rhythm track. And then once this was done, I thought, what is missing here is a bit of an environment. So I was then checking my library for water sounds because I thought, okay, it needs to be kind of, again, alien, water dripping, wet, kind of all these associations that are, of course, cultural references. So this whole sound design was based on playing with cultural references. And then I put the sounds back in live to turn them into a track. But ultimately, of course, it has to work musically. So I ended up using only a tiny fraction of the Foley sounds that I added. But there's a few moments where I'm particularly proud of. And that's in the subtle background things. There's one moment where there is a chord coming in or a pad. And at the beginning of the pad, there is the sound of a wave splashing somewhere on the ocean. And it's just like shh, turning into this pad sound. And if it's completely unnoticeable. But if you focus on it, you realize that actually, yes, there is a splashing wave that is overlaid to the synthetic string sound, and this makes it special. And I love that. I have so much joy doing that. That's where my fun comes in. My personal joy of creating these things.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you, like, obviously with this album and with all others, like, it would be interesting to hear your process. How do you, what does the composition process look like for you? How does a track? I have more questions about staying focused to its completion, especially because these seem like they're complex, and you talk in the liner notes about really having taken your time to ruminate, which I think is something that's very hard to do. In a way of staying focused and not tinkering endlessly. So, but I suppose from the genesis, how do you compose these days, and how do you like to do it?
I'm not sure if I have that one single recipe approach. Sometimes I start composing because I found an interesting sound, and the sound gives me an idea what to do with it. Like, oh my God, I want to hear this sound in a context. So, for instance, I mentioned the ASR10, this old Ensoniq sampler, which I'm having since a very long time, and which I'm rarely using these days because operating it is so tedious. But I occasionally turn it on just to verify if it's still booting. And it did boot, and then I put a floppy in to see if it still loads. And it was one of the early Monolake sounds from 1995 or something like that. And this classical chord sample, a C minor chord. And I played it on a keyboard, and it immediately shouts house. It shouts this old school late 1980s, early 1990s house with this kind of shifts of the minor chords. And I was very tempted to just make a straight kick drum and a bit of reverb and a snare and a hi-hat and a cool bass line. So that sound definitely gave me an idea for a track. And sometimes it's, as I said, this result of just playing with the Lindrum for fun, and then suddenly a sound or a groove emerges where I think, oh, I should keep this. And this sometimes also happens, for instance, when I'm working, testing and exploring stuff at Ableton. what I'm doing is of course, I'm using the software in whatever state it is in, and with a prototype of something, and by using it, I create.
Mm.
So maybe again a drum pattern emerges, or a sound emerges, or anything literally, and then I notice, okay, this might be a material, and then I just save it. So I have this huge folder with sketches, and um, occasionally I look at this folder and I just go through it and reevaluate what's in there. And sometimes I feel that the stuff that I considered important is not important, then it goes to a backup drive and gets forgotten forever. But sometimes I have uh, this happy moments where I notice, wow, what I did a few days ago in the evening is actually cool. And then I decide, okay, I gonna finish that. And
So that is the deliberate thought, I suppose, is a key distinction. I am going to finish it.
exactly.
Yeah.
So making this decision if the material is interesting enough to spend more time with it.
Yeah.
And that decision, of course, also can turn out to be wrong. So I had situations where I was working on tracks for a very long time, again and again, revising them, and ultimately feeling that somehow I lost the magic, or the original idea was not that cool. So I could clearly see, for instance, that the suggested early house track is something that I do for an hour, and afterwards I just think, oh, that's silly. That's really
It's not
silly.
going to fit on my album.
Exactly. So, and then I stop.
How do you think about albums? Do you say consciously that this is the vision, or is there a point where you go, shit, the stuff I've been doing over the last 6 months feels like this. I should wrap it in a bow,
It's a mix, but it leans slightly towards the later. So with studio, it was a very simple scenario. I had an occasion to play live. I think last summer, or maybe time flies so quickly, it's hard to notice anymore. And it was not an important or significant event, and I didn't want to put too much time in preparation, but I also didn't want to play old stuff. And this is when I just opened a few of the sketches that I talked about and just compiled them did cut them into stems and threw them in session view just to be able to play something. And this was a moment where I noticed, hey, there's a few things that are really fitting well together. And I just suddenly got this confirmation that I have actually enough material to make an album. And that was the birth of Studio. But what happened afterwards was that I revised every single track a lot in the process. So after sequencing them, I figured out some of them are too similar, some of them don't feel right if they play right after one another. Some of them changed completely. But from this moment onwards, I really treated every single track as part of the album and reworked every single track to fit the overall picture. What started as single tracks towards the end of the creation process of the album became a movement within a bigger thing.
Yeah. It sounds like the intent can come later.
I think the good thing about rules is that you can break them. It's good to have rules, but it's also important to understand when the rule is in the way of what you want to do.
Yeah. What was your original intent with Live, and how has your way of using it, has it changed in any significant way? And have you evolved with it, or has it evolved with you?
Well, I mean, this whole thing is, of course, the product of a lot of people's ideas and work and coding and input. And over the now 25 years, it's crazy.
That is crazy.
It became something that, like the kids growing older, you still have a certain influence and a certain amount of control, but they they develop on their own. So I observe, I object, I add, I advise, I teach, but ultimately it's to a certain degree definitely out of my control, which is nice. But the original thing, as with so many things, when they start, you don't think about how it's going to be in 25 years. You think how it's going to be next week. And it evolved from a very niche tool that solved a particularly rewarding issue in a nice way and kind of in a fun and innovative way. This idea of playing all these clips together synchronized and having no timeline and having this kind of free definition of when things happen.
I also remember because I used it since version 3, is you never had to stop. You never had to stop the timeline, didn't you?
And maybe it's worth mentioning that when we did this, that was a time when the big studios were using Pro Tools with big hardware rigs. And in Pro Tools, if you wanted to insert an EQ, or if you want to change a track routing, or if you want to create a track or delete a track, you had to stop transport. Yeah. So you were in the middle of the song and everyone is happy and you're listening to it, and someone says, "Oh, can I have a compressor in there?" And you say, "Sure." Stop. Compressor. Play again. And the fact that in live you could just throw in a device whilst running, that really killed people. And it was easy for us to do because our technical foundation was 15 years younger. And now we are the old guys and we have to fight with an old code base and things that are hard for us to improve that are easier to do for people who just start writing software now. That's how it is. But I mean, the software changed as a result of what users are doing with it. We never intended to build a DAW. That was not the original plan. It was our users who said, "Oh, we like this so much. We have so much fun with it. But it would be nice if the editing functions would be a little bit better." And so
if it had MIDI.
Exactly, and have MIDI. And so we step by step ended where we are now. It was really just aimed at providing a solution for people like Gerhard and me and our friends to get complexity and interaction on stage without the necessity to carry around huge racks with samplers and mixers.
Yeah.
I mean, before live, we have been carrying around literally half of the studio, like anyone else in the 80s, in the 90s. So I remember carrying downstairs 5 flight cases with samplers and effects. And of course, half of it broke on the tour. And it was really nice that at some point a laptop running live could do a lot of complexity without the hassle of all that.
What do you think about the phenomenon of the laptop electronic musician, which is something you help create? It's like, what do you think? What do you feel when you see a musician on stage and it's just a laptop? If such a thing happens these days, which it does.
But this is almost historical. There was a time, maybe between 2000 and 2010, where this was the big thing, where people were really discussing, this trope of, is this guy, mostly a guy at this time, checking their emails or not, but this is not a question anymore. You see so many people nowadays performing with laptops and modular rigs or whatever. I feel that this technology discussion is mostly over, and I'm very happy about it. It transcends. People using. If I look at young generations of people making music, they use what they like to use. They don't have any preconception anymore what is right or wrong in this regard. And I really enjoy the fact that they are so just doing what they like to do, and that is great. And if we help them with our software to express themselves, I'm happy. But if they are using anything else on stage, I'm happy too.
I suppose then the question, really at the heart of it for me is like what you, with using a computer on stage and really any live performance, you know, speaking of you personally, what do you like to give yourself to do? You know, what, and I suppose by extension, what do you think are interesting things to have to do live, and what things do you relieve to the computer and offload?
Okay, there's reality and there's my idealistic fantasy of it. In reality, what I'm always having control over, because I find it super essential, is many aspects of the sound. So if there's real-time synthesis, then there's synthesis parameters that I can control: decay times, filters, modulation index, whatever. Just things that allow me to shape something from, let's say, a very sine wavy bass line into a screaming monster, and being able to articulate that. This is the one thing that I enjoy a lot. The other thing, where on a conceptual level I have much more ideas than what I ultimately aim to do, is having access to structure in more complex ways. What I mean with that is the ability to recompose a track immediately, out of a spontaneous feeling of how the track has to be, keeping the complexity of it. And this is the challenging one, because I could, for instance, if I would perform with a drum computer on stage, it is so easy to change the pattern. You know, if you have any drum computer that has this 808 style button line, then you can have so much fun on the fly changing the bass drum, snare, whatever. The problem with this approach is that if you do this, your brain is fully occupied with that, and that's it.
Yeah.
And we saw and we heard all these sets where people are doing this, and some of them are really skilled with that, and it's great to watch them. But ultimately, there's also a limit of the complexity you can reach with that method. And
Do you mean, by the way, like composing on an XOX style thing live? You know,
well,
start with a blank pattern, or
the thing is, not every possible pattern is a good one, and not every possible pattern fits with every other possible element in your composition. So if you are creating a new pattern on the fly on stage, you have to adhere to a certain formalistic style in order to make this a success. So if you lay a straight 4/4 beat, you have certain freedoms where to place elements and still kind of danceable. And this is what people do. And it's great fun, but it's also predictable. And if you want to do something that is more complex rhythmically, more polyrhythmic, more demanding, then there is a lot of things that simply can go wrong. So you might end up with a ratio of 90% of your time you're trying to find something, and 10% of the time you are successful.
yeah,
That is also not acceptable. And that means if your goal is to have, let's say, a really complex drum pattern, but the ability to actually perform it, you have to come up with a clever meta idea what this means. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, if you think about the effort it takes to build something like this, then I personally very often just give up and say, I play a MIDI clip and that's it, you know.
yeah. Well, you could give yourself like some Euclidean generator maybe, and
Yeah,
constrain the
exactly.
parameters, right?
Something like that, exactly. But then again, I end up with some of the patterns are good, but the patterns that are good are also the patterns that I could quickly program by myself. So finding a performance method that combines an interesting aspect of surprise and consistency and meaning is a challenging one. An example where I've noticed and I feel that a lot of energy went into exactly that question, and where the results are in between acceptable and mind-blowingly good, is Outtaker.
Yeah.
So because for them, this is obviously a decision that they made at some point to say, okay, we want this ability to shape, and the process of shaping is so essential to the work that they build a system that allows them to do this. And yeah, so
I mean, do you know more about their how they have you spoken to them about how they do it? Because I'm very interested to like understand what they give themselves to do. Because I mean, I understand a little of it, but
I saw the Max patch on stage, but it's very neat and not very revealing.
Yeah.
But I understand I believe I understand the motivation and the underlying mindset.
It seems that, like, from my understanding, and correct me if you do agree or disagree, they basically, well, they have designed sort of meta patches that are like whole modular synths, of course, that like will have drums and other components they can probably put in, could call tracks, right? And it feels they have like meta states where they're like, you know, hey, this is going to be intro, verse, middle eight, and then they have MIDI controllers for it. Do you know? Do they?
Yeah, they have this nice monome style little controllers. So they have there's definitely a tactile element there.
And is that buttons to choose? And
there's buttons and dials.
Yeah.
In a way, the usual. So, but there's definitely a lot of meta thinking, like a knob or a function that controls a structure instead of setting or deleting a step on a hi-hat.
Yeah.
And that I find really rewarding.
It also, I was going to say, it does very quickly, seems like they, if I'm not mistaken, that they play live with the same things they compose with. Is that possibly
hard to judge from the outside,
because that is an interesting approach in and of itself. I mean, you know, if you have that control,
you know, if you build a setup that is so complex and turned out to work so well, why not using it also for the creation itself? In that regard, it makes complete sense to me.
With the, like, what did the Monodeck do? What did you give yourself to do in physicality with that? I was also going to ask you, sorry, it's a long question, but then I've also seen you, I saw you play at, I think it was Houghton, and you were doing the quadraphonic thing in like a warehouse, and you had a Circlon, and I was like, which was unexpected. I was like, I did not expect you to be using that sequencer, and you know, and so I suppose from those two approaches, what was the intent, and what with the Monodeck, what did it afford you?
Well, the Monodeck was an interesting one because I built it at the time of Live 3, and I started building it, and it was basically really my ideal physical controller for Live, with the idea of controlling 8 tracks with volume, effect sense, and 3 parameters that I can assign, and a effect section, so that really I have a physical representation in front of me without menu diving. That is the main mixing and synthesis in the center, and the clip matrix, and on the left side the individual effects, a delay and a reverb with every parameter that I wanted to control on a knob, and on the right side everything that is in the master channel. And that worked incredibly well and was an enormous amount of fun. The reason why I stopped using it at some point was very, very simple. This thing is heavy. And together with the flight case, this was 20 kilograms.
Oh, wow.
And it was the only one of its kind. And I was traveling, for instance, through South America with it. And, you know, you are at the immigration and you're waiting for 3 hours to the immigration, you come through, and you think of your precious flight case with your once in the world existing device where you spent 9 months building it, rotating on the circle, and a conveyor belt where literally every single person who is interested in this case can just grab it.
Yeah.
And
what could possibly go wrong?
Exactly. And at some point I thought, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. And now it's in my living room, and people occasionally comment on it.
I mean, I was going to say, this is also the problem, is that now, yeah, yeah, like, yeah.
We are, for those who are not seeing it, we are just holding up a launch control.
Yeah. It's becoming a solved problem, and obviously, like, Akai, and then everyone's now creating controllers that, and so I suppose, yeah, it begs that question of what's the the kinds of controls that you give yourself to use, and it sounds like they're more meta ones these days than specific.
Well, that launch control thing, it's not the most beautiful thing on the planet, but it does the job. And if it breaks or if someone steals it, I just go on the Thomann website or whatsoever, and next day I have a new one. And it gives me just a little bit more peace of mind. And that is actually also nice when performing.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned the Circlone, I really admire that product. I know Colin, the inventor of it. He's a good friend, and I applaud him for being so stubborn.
Yeah,
because he's building this box and he's dedicating more or less his professional life into it, and it is amazing in one side. It is tedious in other aspects. It has personality. It's beautiful. It's powerful. It's an instrument. It's a true instrument with all the pros and cons of an instrument. And if I would say in a planet where Ableton Live would not exist, I could see myself using really the Circlone as the centerpiece of my sequencing.
But yeah, Ableton Live exists is the thing.
Sorry, Colin.
yeah. Well, I have both. I haven't got a Circlone. I also have Ableton Live. Well, I was going to ask you if you do use the session view or the arrangement view more in Live, because I reflect on the fact that I actually weirdly just bought an Atari to try and use some of the old sequencers, things like Creator and Notator, bless their little cotton socks. And I'm reminded of Live in a way. I know that the session view, clip view, this whole thing is sort of trackery,
like the pattern.
It is also sort of like Creator, and in a way, they feel related. I wonder how that way of working. There are two different ways of working: this top down, this left right thing. And I know that when the Atari was king, that when Cubase came out, everyone was just like, oh my God, I will never go back to the top down weird view. I will never do that. I always want to see my track laid out in that way. I'm curious about what you feel about those, that way of working and what.
There's pragmatism. When I'm working in studio on tracks, it's arrangement. But for this live performance that I have in 3 days, where I want to improvise, it's all session view.
Yeah.
And in a studio, I use session view very often to quickly try things out. Throwing a sound in there, playing it, seeing if it fits with the others. Or for recording quickly on the fly. Yeah. So it's a very non-pragmatic switching between those two.
Do you tend to when you're working on sound design, do you throw stuff into like a simpler or a sampler, or do you put the actual waveform on the timeline and manipulate it in an individual track?
Most of the time I put it in the timeline because I like to explore what the different kind of warping, transposition stuff is doing.
Yeah.
So that is more my way of working. But I also throw things in samplers, of course. Yeah.
I have always wished for a long time that Ableton Live had a way of putting effects onto individual clips. And I don't know. Would you like that?
Yes. No, I mean, everyone wants that.
Put in a support ticket.
It is. The problem with all these wishes is from the outside, it might seem that there's maybe 10, 50 wishes that everyone has. From the inside, it is more the dimension of several thousand wishes. And every single of them is valid. And every single of them is conceptual or programming or both work to implement. And this is sometimes really, really kind of borderline frustrating, because you see all these wishes, and to every single one I can only say, yeah, I know, it bothers me too. But being on the inside, I also know what it means to change it. And this the kind of the running gag is, how hard can it be, just add a button?
Yeah.
And
said by someone who has never built anything or like understands that adding a button can blow up another button.
Oh, exactly. And I myself often fall into this thinking of, okay, let's just quickly change this because I have a better idea how it can work. And then I'm convinced that this is a job of a few days and it's non-controversial and everything. And then, someone looks at it for the first time and says, yeah, but now I can't do a multi-selection anymore over several clips because blah, blah.
Mm.
And then you look at it and think, oh, shit, I didn't consider that problem. And then you ultimately say, well, we don't have a good answer for that, so let's go back to the old version. And yeah, this is something where making a product that has a huge user base, and people rely on that certain workflows are how they are, everything you change, even if you think it's an improvement, it might be a problem for someone else. And yeah, it's tricky, but we're working on it. So some of the things that people complained about for a long time will ultimately at some point be improved. I mean, every single release we are improving things that are really high on the wish list of people, and
yeah,
we do our best.
I was going to reflect on the fact that it also weirdly feels like if you look at pictures of like Live One, it doesn't actually look that different to how it is like intrinsically.
Yeah, but this is good and bad at the same time. It's good because it showed that the initial concept was valuable, and it's good because it gives the sense of feeling at home. But this is also an aspect where occasionally I wish we could have some broad ideas, or actually we have broad ideas, like radical ideas. But then when we try to iterate through, we run in all these kind of problems. And sometimes it would be so much more fun to just start over from scratch and make a new product. But of course, that's not what we're going to do, because
there are a lot of people that rely on it.
Exactly.
They love it.
You're responsible for it. Yeah.
Also, you have just created the move, and you've got like there's things like this, and there are other ways of using Live in effect. I wanted to ask you about some favorite devices, but I'm curious. You seem to be a Synclavier head. Would that be fair to say? Can you talk a bit about that? That machine and what I have read somewhere, I don't know if this is true, that part of Live's inspiration comes from the Synclavier.
I mean, parts of Live's inspiration comes from everything.
Yeah. Is that true? Is it true? And
I wouldn't call it like that. The Synclavier is at the same point amazing as it is ridiculous. So so if someone today wants to start making music and money is not the objection, the last thing I would recommend that person is getting an old Synclavier. It makes no sense whatsoever. It did make a lot of sense 40 years ago or 30. It started as a university project based around a mini computer in opposition to microcomputer, so big computer, with some synthesis capabilities at Dartmouth College in the US. And it turned into a commercial product a little bit later, which was a very kind of crude and strange FM synthesizer with a built-in sequencer and music printing facility, so you could connect a printer since it was a computer system.
Of course.
It could also do a very early on 16-bit monophonic sampling to hard disk at a time when no one else did do this. So you could run whole backtracks of pieces from the hard disk at a time where people were still spinning tape around. So all that was super cool. And they managed to get a user interface concept together with this big jog wheel and a lot of buttons and LEDs that once you were used to it was really, really fast to operate. So early Synclavier users loved the fact that they could be so quick. And this is why a lot of musicians who could afford such a system also enjoyed using it on stage or as a centerpiece for composition. I mean, most notable people like Frank Zappa, but Pat Metheny, Kraftwerk had a Synclavier system, a big one, and so on. And later they added polyphonic sampling, which with 16-bit stereo sampling at 100 kilohertz at a time where the competition had, I don't know, 8-bit, 12 bits, and much. So the idea was always, let's build the biggest, most expensive, most crazy system you can build. And then they got eaten by companies like Emu Systems and Sonic Archive, who made much more affordable systems that basically ultimately could do nearly as much for
good enough at 5% of the price.
Exactly.
Or less.
And that was the death of it. So the question is, why would you want to engage with such a system nowadays? As far as the small FM version is concerned, because it sounds so gnarly. So it sounds really, really completely different from what you would expect from Yamaha or any FM software synthesizer, because it's the way they do the math in there is brutal. It's shifting bits around. It's 8-bit integer table lookup stuff. For those who know what this means, it's rough. It's noisy. It's rough. It's dirty, and for some strange reason, this makes it extremely musical in a really weird way. There is some fascination to the dirt there. So this is the one aspect, and there is a similar aspect to the sampling, that whatever you throw in, if you transpose it a lot down, it exposes. It's like slowing tape down, but not. There is some magic to it.
I did interview the guy from Synclavier, and it's like he did try to explain it. I've had other people try to explain what is happening there, and it interests me. Especially when I know there's a talk of warping in Ableton is sort of. I know, like, since Live 8, there was this whole controversy that, like, warping is making your sound bad, but, like, it's interesting, that concept of time stretching well and time stretching badly, and I don't know what the difference is.
Ultimately, it's a dinosaur. And it's still very fast in operating for certain things. So it has this big keyboard here, and I can just call up a sample, let's say a single piano note, and I hit one other button, which is record, and I just play. And it records it as a sequence. That's it. And this alone is such a great thing. And if I've played something for half an hour and I liked it, then I have the recording, and then I can actually export this as MIDI and do something with it, or I can record the sound or whatever. But the reason why I got this system, the big one, is actually because I know it technically very well, because I'm curious, and this system was intended to be sold, and I was hired as a technical advisor. So I looked at the system and checked if it's working, and I wrote down what is all broken, and a lot was broken, and I gave an estimation of the value and all these kind of things. But I never wanted to have it because it's this huge rack that's now sitting here in the way. And it was from a person died, and it was stuff that belonged to that person, and they wanted to get rid of it, and at some point they really begged me to take it. So
Yeah.
I got it basically for the material value, and then I invested, I don't know, half a 6 month repairing, sourcing parts, talking with other experts to get it back to run, and now I have it. And since I have it, I use it, but it's not something that I would have had on my bucket list.
Mm. What does it teach you then? I mean, is there still, do you feel it still has, beyond its gnarliness and its speed, is that it? What can we learn from it?
There's some nice, clever user interface elements, how things work. So if it comes to how you control a sequencer via hardware, there's definitely some details that are nicely done, and you can grab ideas from that. The other thing it teaches is listening, because it comes with this computer screen and a terminal, but most of the operation is just happening from the keyboard with all the buttons on it. And that means the only display you have is, for that time, a pretty fancy alphanumerical LED display. But it's basically one line of text. And that means instead of looking at a filter graph or looking at a waveform or anything like this, you just play and you adjust and you listen. And I find it often problematic that when you use software, you spend so much time actually looking at things. You define where the break has to be according to the look of the piece and not according to what you're hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And very often I deliberately turn off the screen when listening to my music. And I just hit stop when I think something needs to change. And I don't care if it is then 1 minute or 3 minutes or whatever. And these old machines, including the Synclavier, tell you to play and listen.
Yeah. I am sure I saw a Max patch or a Max for Life patch that makes the screen go black when you hit spacebar.
Yeah, I made that one.
There you go. Thank you for that. I might have to install it because that's a good one.
It's simply called black.
Yeah. I mean, you can close your eyes, I know, but sometimes we forget because we're so visual as creatures. Yeah. If you had to choose an analog synth to take on a desert island, do you have one or something close to one?
That is a challenging question. I mean, it's already difficult with a synthesizer in general, but if it's analog, I have to admit I'm a bit tempted to have a closer look at the Moog Muse, which seems to be very powerful and nicely done, but I never touched it or actually seen it. I might consider a small portable Eurorack case with a dedicated selection of modules, maybe the thing to do, simply because of the amount of possibilities. Maybe a small Eurorack thing and a 4-track tape recorder. Yes, so a Fostex 4-track tape recorder, an unlimited stock of working cassettes, exactly, and a small modular rig. That should
I think that's fair. Fine, done. What is it they say on Desert Island Disc? You also have to take the Bible. I'm not going to make you do that.
Yeah, but no, a Bible is good, but you need at least 2 of them so you can put your monitor speakers on.
Yes, exactly. Well, final question is what is the future of music technology?
Oh, God. I have no idea.
What would you like the future of music technology to be, I suppose, is more the question.
The problem is I'm pretty much in peace with what I have. The older I get, the more I'm concerned with expressing myself in a meaningful way with the things I already have at my disposal. I'm not looking for new gear. I'm not looking for new features, whatever.
No new way of working.
Exactly.
But you're happy with that?
It can always be improved. There's always details that I hate. There's always things that I would do better. But it's not that I say, oh my God, I can't continue being professional without tool XYZ. These days are long over. But it's also clear that, I mean, the big elephant in the room is, of course, AI. We're just at the beginning, and it's very clear that it will change a lot of creative industries and a lot of ways how people create. And there's no way around it. We are, as a company, looking into it, of course. Every company is doing this because, well, it's gonna affect how what people expect that is possible. And I see interesting things there. But ultimately, where this is gonna end and how much of it ultimately really will change how the majority of people is actually creating, it's really hard to foresee. You could argue that for many people, this idea of typing in a prompt and getting a track out is what they want. If you consider it a job, writing uplifting music in D major for a car commercial, definitely the AI can take over that job. Why should I go through stupid brass libraries and fire up 10 instances of Spectrasonics to get the correct sound design for contemporary car commercials? That is gone. That's already more or less dead. But if I can choose between sitting in front of my Synclavier playing some piano sample at night with some lexicon reverb on it and figuring out what my fingers actually can do, or typing in Chopin like 127 BPM F flat major, then I know that I personally would prefer actually training my fingers. And this is I think in between there is the reality of what we are facing in the future. People will still want to do the manual labor of moving MIDI notes around and editing audio and playing instruments and moving knobs. And people will also want to be able to type in some commands to create results that they could never be able to play. And well, what this means for software, we will see.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a long talk.
Thank you. I liked having a long talk with you, Robert. Robert's new album, Studio, of which we were talking about, is out now, along with all the other beautiful things he creates and the live shows that he does. You can go and find his album. Go and look it up, Monolake Studio, and all his other music and projects. He is a wonderful person to talk to and a font of knowledge of a person who is so legitimately making it happen on a daily basis. And yeah, his whole thing about my key takeaway was, how are you blending? How are you using Ableton Live and not fixating too much on it when you also have hardware around you? And it was very interesting to hear him say the thing that, he basically ingests all the sounds, does all the sound design as one process, and then he does the music making as the second process. It seems he separates the sound design from the music writing. And that seems to be such a significant way of doing something like this, because it is so easy to go down wormholes, especially if you try and use things like modular synths. They are, by their definition, vastly time-consuming and fixating things. You just cannot quickly go to a modular synth and patch a sound from scratch. That is not a thing. But you absolutely can spend a whole afternoon just enjoying yourself on a modular synth and spitting out sounds. Like, I don't do the thing that he does of just, let's make some sounds. And actually what I end up doing is I just sort of find little loops and noodles that I might like to save later and throw them into a folder. But I don't actually want loops and noodles. I want one-shots when it comes to it. And so his thing about I just make drum hits and single sounds, I think that is just so obviously like the better way of doing it. And filling up folders with one-shots. So it's actually something that a realization I had recently. It was like, I'm going to do that more. When I have like a patch set up or an interesting sound, just record one hit of it and stick it in a folder. No more than one hit, or maybe at C3 and C1. But like, that's all you need. Just that's useful. And then you think about making music in things like trackers, then that would be just pure gold. Yes. Some things are so bleedingly obvious, it takes 20 years to work it out. Every day is a school day. So, yes, thank you, Robert. I hope you found this interesting. And I would encourage you to check out his album Studio as well as all his other music. Thank you to the beautiful people of Thonk, who sponsored this episode. That is Love Synth. You remember that? Love Synth, to get 10% off until the 1st of January 2025. Sorry to you if you're listening later, you missed it, but still worth going to Thonk. And obviously, thank you, Signal Sounds, for sponsoring once again and so wonderfully. If you have enjoyed this, please also consider sponsoring on Patreon. Yes, I will ask you shamelessly. Please consider sponsoring on Patreon to help support future Bleeps. It's been real, folks. That's 2024. And I will now leave you with the thought that the next year is 2025 and we're halfway through the 20s. The 20s? I honestly, in my mind, think it's still just been the 90s. And somehow we're a quarter of a century into a new century. It is not okay in any way, shape or form. Can someone please stop time? Or at least slow it down a little bit. I hope you will find some time to be chill and enjoy yourself in this holiday period. And I wish you the most wonderful of New Year's. Thanks very much. And we'll see you next time. Bye.